Protests are exploding across the country on college campuses, including the University of Minnesota, in support of Palestinians in Gaza. Students are demanding a ceasefire and that universities divest of any investment or ties to Israel. The protests show no sign of ending and are in fact growing.
Now, this is Talking Points on CBS News Minnesota.
Good evening and welcome to Talking Points. I'm Esme Murphy. There is tension, anger, and fear on college campuses across the country, including at the University of Minnesota, where demonstrators have also set up encampments and held rallies. Tonight in Talking Points, you will hear from students who are directly involved in the leadership on both the Palestinian and Israeli sides. You will hear from a constitutional law professor on exactly what rights students and universities have. And we'll also hear from two other students participating in the protests, including one that was arrested. What's their motivation and how do they respond to the criticism that the protests are anti-Semitic and minimize what happened in Israel on October 7th? Let's start with a 21-year-old Palestinian American from Augsburg University. Well, joining us right now is Sana Wazwaz. She is a student at Augsburg College. She is also the president of the Minnesota chapter of American Muslims for Palestine. Thank you so much for talking with us. Thank you for having me. All right. Obviously, you're not at the U, but you have certainly been lending your support to the protests at the U of M. What's this been like, and what do you see as the core issue in these protests?
Well, first of all, what it's been invigorating and inspiring to no end for Palestinian students like me who have felt perpetual heartbreak and heartache for the past 6 months, seeing that we've been bannering, we've been picketing, we've been tabling to no end, and institutions have refused to budge. So seeing something like this, to this tenacity and this level of mobilization, unlike anything we have seen since the 1970s with the Vietnam student protests, this has brought me a level of hope and joy that I didn't think I could feel in so long. Now, what do I think the issue here at hand is? I think the issue at hand is that institutions like the University of Minnesota have been refusing to listen to their student body, have been refusing to listen to every non-disruptive protest means that has been used in the past 6 years. And I think at this point, the students have resorted to the encampments because if there are no material stakes, there's no material gain, there's no material change. And so the students are using this because they've determined that business as usual cannot continue unless President Jeff Ettinger realizes that that the cost is human life, that the time to act is now.
What is the situation with your family? Your family is not actually in Gaza. You told me they're in the West Bank, where the situation is better. There's not an active war going on, but they're still experiencing hardships.
Yeah, so my family, I don't have any family inside of Gaza right now. They're all in the West Bank. The hardship that they are experiencing is that which has preceded October 7th by 75 years and is continuing for the 76th year. And that is the apartheid regime, which subjects the Palestinian people to treatment like second-class citizens within their own homes. So right now, I can't get any access to my family and actually get them to talk about what's happening because they know that they're being surveilled. They know that soldiers could punish them, could imprison them for something as simple as like a WhatsApp message telling me what's happening. Any innocuous expression, any just mere communication of what is happening in the West Bank could be grounds for them to go to jail. I mean, I have a cousin actually that was thrown in jail because he attended a peaceful protest right here at Bryant Square Park in Minneapolis. That's all he did. He just attended the protest. He didn't even organize it. And when he went back to Palestine, he was taken to jail, which he is now staying there for 6 months. This is the kind of daily brutality that the Palestinian people have experienced long before October 7th for over 76 years.
Well, let me ask you about this, and I got a feeling I know where you're going to be coming from because you may have already answered it. There are critics who say that these protesters are glossing over what happened on October 7th. Is that true?
What do you mean by that? Like, why?
Well, the protesters are not acknowledging that 1,100 people were killed in the attack on Israelis on October 7th.
Is acknowledging that 1,100 people were killed mutually exclusive to protesting and understanding the contextualization and understanding that occupation precedes it all? I mean, that's like asking, hold on, that's like asking if the civil rights movement or if abolition protests, like that's like asking if they're glossing over the people killed in Nat Turner's slave revolt. Like, you can acknowledge that people were killed in a revolt. You can acknowledge that people were killed in a rebellion. You can acknowledge that atrocities were committed while still understanding that the context is slavery. The context is the thing that Nat Turner was rebelling against, and that the current crimes being committed are not justified by whatever happened on October 7th. But we are way past the point of being able to say that Israel is defending themselves, and they have never been able to make the argument that they are defending themselves because they are inherently in an offensive posture by being an occupier. Occupiers have no right to self-defense because by occupying territory, they have ceded that right. They have postured themselves as the offensive. So I just don't really understand where this argument is coming from that these protests are glossing over the people that were killed on October 7th, just as much as I would understand the argument that civil rights protests are glossing over white people that were killed in Nat Turner's rebellion. I think we have to look at the power imbalance here. We have to look at the fact that nothing that happened on October 7th is justification for the deliberate starvation of the people of Gaza. Israeli officials have very openly said that they are targeting civilians. Giora Aylan, who is the defense advisor to the Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, said very openly, and this is just an explicit quote that she made, that this is not about Hamas, this is about all the civilian officials. Netanyahu has echoed similar statements. Smotrich has echoed similar statements. We can list senior official after senior official that has said very openly and clearly that they are targeting civilians. We are past the point of being able to say that this is about October 7th. So many investigations have come forward. For example, the 972 magazine investigation, which was published, which found that Israeli intelligence officials had designated civilian entities as, quote, power targets. This is their language by Israeli intelligence. And were striking these entities knowing that there were no militants there because they wanted to strike fear in Palestinian civil society. We cannot keep bringing up October 7th here in this context when civilians are being deliberately starved, maimed, deprived of food, brutalized to no end. I mean, there is just absolutely no justification for this.
Sana Wazwaz, thank you so much. We really appreciate your input.
Thank you.
Up next, a U of M senior who is a leading voice of Jewish students on campus and the perspective of a constitutional law professor on the rights of protesters and the rights of universities. Joining us right now is Ethan Fine. He is a senior graduating with a degree in journalism this year, and he is active in a number of Jewish organizations on campus. Thank you so much, Ethan.
Definitely. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, I want to ask, first of all, because I'm sure the viewers will be able to see that you're wearing a blue tag with the number 207 on it, and you also have a dog tag with the Star of David. Explain what those two things mean.
Definitely. So both of them draw sort of attention and significance to the number of days that the hostages have been held captive in Gaza since October 7th. So 207 is today's number. It's been 207 days since October 7th, since these hostages were innocently taken and held hostage in Gaza. And then the dog tag actually is a Star of David, a little bit of Hebrew on it. And then it says in English as well, bring them home now. And that's the big message here, is that I think the Jewish community and myself especially have been trying to spread is we want our hostages home. We want them home now. We want them to let our people go.
Since you brought that up, I mean, there are not only protests here at home on college campuses all over the country, there are some pretty big protests in Israel as well.
Definitely. There's been a lot of the families of those held hostage in Gaza have been trying to draw a lot of attention and put a lot of pressure on the Israeli government as well as the American government to really turn the focus back to these hostages and say these were innocent civilians who were captured out of their homes, out of a music festival, with no regard to human life, and we want them home.
Have you or any of your friends who are Jewish been harassed or been the target of anti-Semitic actions on campus?
For sure. I think anti-Semitism on campus has always existed. There's always been anti-Semitic rhetoric. It was something actually, as a Jewish student coming up to Minnesota for school, it was something I was warned pretty heavily about, that Minnesota has had a history with some anti-Semitism before. I'd say I've been lucky enough throughout my time in college to dodge anything too personal. but I would say a lot of the organizations I've been with have been attacked, harassed. I know Hillel very early on, the Jewish organization I'm probably most involved with, had a display outside of the building that had photographs of the hostages who had been taken, and that was trampled on and kicked over. So that was definitely tough to see, and definitely something that affected me.
Do you consider the protests themselves, are they anti-Semitic or are they anti the policy of President Benjamin Netanyahu? And can you draw a distinction between those two questions? Is it possible to?
Definitely. So I think you bring up a great point. Is what we're seeing? We're being told it's anti-Zionist. We're being told it's anti-Netanyahu. We're being told, but we're feeling like it's anti-Semitic. And I think it's very important to educate people and also draw a distinct difference of what all of this means. So anti-Zionism is essentially saying that the Jewish people do not have the right to self-determination. Now, the issue that I think many Jewish people or Zionists take with this is that most of the people who would call themselves anti-Zionist, who are against the self-determination of the Jewish people having a country and a homeland, are fighting very clearly to preserve the self-determination of other groups of people. So for the Jews and for the Zionists, when you see that someone is targeting the self-determination of just the Jewish people, that inherently feels anti-Semitic. And that's where we draw that line. Now, most of the Jews I know, most of the Zionists I know, are very critical of Benjamin Netanyahu and his policies and his government. He's most certainly a leader with controversy.
And are they critical of his policies in this war?
I would say yes, that most people are critical of his policies in this war, but I would say it did not start in this war. Netanyahu has been in power for a very long time, and most of the people I know have been critical of him for years. And so I think the issue is that a lot of people have a hard time seeing that Jewish people and Zionist people can be critical of the Israeli government. People say, how can you be critical of the Israeli government? You love Israel. I love Israel, but I know that the government is not perfect. I'm American, but I know that the government is not perfect. And I think being a supporter of a nation, you need to be critical of the government. You need to say, if you're a responsible citizen, you need to point out the flaws and try to improve constantly. And so I would say many Jews and many Zionists are very critical of Netanyahu at this time, and for good reason.
These protests don't seem to be going away. If anything, they're growing, and they're growing in intensity. Is there any resolution to this? And are you concerned about that?
I am hopeful that it comes out and that the war ends in a peaceful manner, that Palestinians and Israelis alike can live in peace. However, I do not think that this is going away. I think that as long as time has existed, as long as the Jewish people have existed, there has always been sort of an effort to wipe them off the face of the earth. And it takes different forms in different generations. And this is a form we're seeing now. And I think the underlying motives behind that will always be there. The shape it takes will change. So I think in 5 years from now, we probably will not have these encampments and this large a protest, but something will still be there that is the same underlying motive as what we are seeing today.
All right. Well, listen, Ethan, thank you very much. We appreciate your insights. Well, joining us right now, Professor David Schultz of Hamline University. You have helped us out so many times. I'm turning it to you again for some insight into this. Thank you for coming on.
My pleasure. Thank you, Esme.
In terms of these protests, what is legal, what is not legal, especially at a public university?
Well, first off, keep in mind that a public university has to follow the First Amendment, which means it has to afford the same type of free speech rights that any other governmental entity would have to provide. And the general answer is that speech is protected until such time as the person speaking advocates what's called imminent lawlessness, and that lawlessness is imminent. And by that, if somebody were to say, for example, let's go damage some property. Let's right now go hurt this person right next to us or something like that. That clearly crosses the line. So the law gives an incredible amount of leeway to the what's called the content of speech.
All right.
But
There's been a lot of attention, though, focused on having tents on school grounds, both in private universities and public universities. Where does that come in, and is it different at a public university?
even though the content of the speech is protected, a university, like any governmental entity, can do some time, place, and manner restrictions. And what it can do is to say, for example, that in the public lands, let's say the quad of the University of Minnesota, for example, in front of Northrop or Morrill Hall or something like that, it can say that you have to have a permit to be able to camp or to, let's say, set up a booth in terms of perhaps, let's say, doing leafleting or something like that. They can't make a judgment and say, we like your message, therefore you can camp. We don't like your message, you can't camp. They have to be, again, what's called content neutral and viewpoint neutral. They can't target your speech, but they can say that the camping is a an activity in itself that's not speech, and they can regulate that or perhaps ban that.
Can the colleges kick these kids out for protesting in this way in violation of what they have said are their rules?
If they are punishing them for the content of their speech, the answer is no. If they are punishing them for, let us say, violation of other types of rules, let us say trespass and so forth, they can expel them or discipline them, but the students are entitled to institutional due process. The federal constitution will require that they have some type of hearing. Now, it may not be a full-blown judicial hearing like we think about in court, but some type of hearing before a school can just expel them or discipline them in some form of fashion.
All right. Well, Professor David Schultz, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Up next, we explore the motives of local protesters, the vast majority of whom are not Palestinian, Muslim, or of Jewish heritage. All right, well, joining us right now is Freyja Wolfe, and she is actually one of the University of Minnesota students who was arrested. Freyja, thank you so much for joining us. You're back on campus. Why are you doing this? Why are you engaging in these protests?
I think it comes from a lot. I grew up in an anti-war community during the Iraq War and the War on Terror, and I work with a lot of Afghan refugees in my home community. And I just think that this level of devastation and violence requires people to step up when they can and when they have the ability to. And I saw this as an opportunity to voice my voice and support people that I think need it.
I'd like to ask you about some of the criticisms that have been leveled at protesters by the Jewish community and people who are not in the Jewish community. One is that you're minimizing what happened on October 7th. Do you think that's true?
I don't think so. I think we've talked about it a lot, and I think mass violence is always horrible. And I understand that when people you love and care about die, that is atrocious and not good. But I do just think we also just want to make sure we're protecting people, and in the end we just want we want a lot of things, but first we want a ceasefire. So yeah. But
and also the criticism is that these protests are actually not so much against the policy of Israel, but that they're anti-Semitic, and you've got kids or students or non-students, yelling anti-Semitic slurs. Is that happening? And do you feel these protests are anti-Semitic?
I'm not Jewish, so I don't think I get the final say on that, but I know there have been a lot of Jewish students and activists at our encampment, and I've heard a couple of them speak, and their opinions have been very impactful and important. I have not heard any of the sort of any anti-Semitic things, and I hope that is not happening anywhere. That would be very, again, we have policies for our encampment, and anybody that would do any sort of bigotry, including and especially anti-Semitism, wouldn't be allowed.
You're back on campus now. Obviously, you're still going through things with the university. Has this been worth it to you, what you've gone through?
I would say so, yes. In the end, we've had a lot of support from faculty and fellow students and the community in general. So that has been great and made this a much easier process. And in the end, I believe in what I'm fighting for and what I'm talking about, and want an end to this genocide and the relentless bombing of Palestinians. So I do believe it was worth it, yes.
And you see this as a genocide, which Israel steadfastly maintains it is not.
I think it's complicated, and I don't actually fully understand the definition of genocide, but I have seen a lot of experts call it that. So that is what I'm going with right now, but I am by no means an expert.
All right. Well, Freyja, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Well, joining us right now is Gillian Rath. She has been part of the protests, and she did just graduate from the University of Minnesota. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, let me ask you, first of all, congratulations on graduating. First of all, why are you doing this? Why are you involved in these protests?
Well, I mean, me personally, I've been involved in the movement for several years, long before October 7th. And I've actually even been protesting for a free Palestine long before October 7th. But right now, this is a really critical moment in this fight, because we are seeing mobilizations like we haven't ever seen before in the fight for a free Palestine, and especially on college campuses, which is where my roots lie as an activist, is with Students for a Democratic Society at the University of Minnesota. So right now, this is what we need to be doing as activists who have experience, who organize on college campuses. This is the movement that is blowing up right now all over the country. And I'm like really, really happy and feel very powerful to be a part of it.
There are also critics that say this is one of the main criticisms, that these protesters are minimizing or glossing over what happened on October 7th, when more than 1,100 Palestinians, including a lot of young people at a concert, were slaughtered. Mm-hmm. How do you respond to that?
Well, I respond to that and telling people to look at the history of the Palestinians' fight for liberation. It goes long, long before October 7th. Palestine has been fighting for their land back and for their autonomy in non-violent ways for a really, really long time, and have not been successful. They have been met with starvation. They have been met with violence and bombs. And Gaza, the people in Gaza have not been able to leave for decades. And to that, I say they have exhausted peaceful means in many ways. And I think looking at a fight for national liberation in this way and saying that their use of violence is not valid or legitimate is ignoring the fact that they have been met with violence for a long time.
Are you justifying what happened on October 7th?
We're not justifying by any means, but we also know that national liberation and the fight for Palestinian freedom, like I said, we say by any means necessary, and they have exhausted most of their options for peaceful means. They have.
Where do you see this going in the next few days, few months?
I mean, our fight on campus, that's what we're focusing on right now, is this small, it's not a small demand, but in relatively smaller demand of university divestment. I see the student movement reaching much bigger levels than just our universities. It's been getting global attention. There have been student protests happening on every single continent right now, and people are paying attention, I think.
Thank you very much for explaining it to us. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
And finally, the university's perspective. The U of M has sent statements to students, including these. The University of Minnesota recognized that lawful protests are a form of free speech, not only protected by the First Amendment, but part of the public discourse of the university. The expression of free speech must also respect the law and university policies, which the university must uphold. And the university has very little direct business or investments in Israel or Palestine. We have 2 study abroad programs in Israel currently suspended because of the war. And that does it for this edition of Talking Points. We will continue to follow this developing story here at home and across the nation. As always, please send any comments or suggestions to Esme at WCCO.com. The show streams every Wednesday and Thursday at 6:30 and 9:30 p.m. On Friday, it posts to YouTube for on-demand viewing. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Esme Murphy, WCCO News.